Hello, theory students. This is a video here on the political philosophy of Machiavelli in a few short minutes. Machiavelli, in the study of political theory and the study of political philosophy, Machiavelli represents a transition point. We leave the ancients and the ideas that came with ancient philosophers, and we embark on a new conception of political philosophy and political theory. The idea here is that with Machiavelli, he's the first person to really tell us that we can study politics as a phenomena on its own. Whereas, Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, other people in the Middle Ages, and the ancient Roman and ancient Greek world thought that everything was fused together, right? You couldn't understand politics unless you understood religion, unless you understood science, right? You couldn't compartmentalize different phenomena, right? They all had to be synthesized together. Machiavelli says no, right? In order for us to study political phenomena, in order for us to understand what's happening in politics, we need to free them from these illusions woven by the past, that they're all connected, right? We need to be able to study politics on its own terms. Okay? And so we get this book called The Prince by Machiavelli, which is about how a ruler ought to govern, and he gives us advice to the book is made out to the Medicis, right? The ruling princes of Florence and its growing republic and empire. So Machiavelli wants to give advice on, how do you maintain control over area you have? When you conquer new lands, how do you keep those lands under your control? And what are the challenges that hereditary rulers face? And what are the challenges that non-hereditary rulers face, for people that govern either by conquest, rule now by conquest, or some other vehicle, right, election or something like that. And so Machiavelli really wants to create a philosophy here that teaches rulers how to govern effectively. Right? And it's no longer about being a moral ruler or an upstanding ruler or the most virtuous ruler, right, like we have with Plato and Aristotle. That's sort of irrelevant at this point. The goal here is stability and security. And for Machiavelli, he wants to teach rulers what's important. Okay? He tells us that society is rapidly changing. And so old notions of legitimacy are obsolete. So like hereditary rule, because traditionally people gotten hereditary rule forever. He says that's really dangerous because you don't need any special skill to rule. You didn't get picked to rule because of you're really good at something or you're really knowledgeable at something. You were picked to rule because you were born into a family that ruled. And the pre-settled norms and attitudes about this are changing, he says. Right? In the time that Machiavelli is writing, we get a growth of city-states and republics, and the ideas, especially in Italy at this time, or hereditary rule is seen very skeptically, and so that's really dangerous because if you're a hereditary ruler, you may be a total, and the norms of the past that protected you aren't going to continue to protect you anymore. They're just not. And so it's really dangerous to be a hereditary ruler. And so he's got advice for hereditary rulers. And he's also got advice for people who rule by conquest or dominion. And he says that's really what those people provide a real opportunity to forge a new science of politics. Because you're not conquering something by accident necessarily, right? You maybe rule hereditarily because of the accident of your birth, but it's very hard to accidentally take over a country or take over a territory. And so by looking at the skills of people who rule by conquest, that can help us to identify the best ways that a ruler can rule. And so it's a real pure way. If you're trying to conquer places, you're trying to seek glory. If you want to seek glory, that means you want to avoid defeat and humiliation. So you're much more attentive than a hereditary prince, right? Who really doesn't have much room for glory, right? Your only goal is to not be disgraced by being overthrown. You could win some glory by conquering other lands, but really, when you're born a prince, there's not a whole lot of room for you to shine. New princes, right? New people who take over, they can really create their own realms and their stamp on it. But if you're going to conquer a place, he says, you've got to make it safe for you. And the first thing you do is you got to get rid of all the nobles. You got to kill all the nobles. Get rid of them. They're not going to be loyal to you. The nobles look out simply for themselves. So the first thing a new ruler needs to do is get rid of all the old nobles. You want to get rid of them, one, because they're going to try and plot against you because they want power. And two, it'll ingratiate you to the people because people will see you as overthrowing the old hierarchical aristocratic order. But then you create your own nobles. That's one piece of advice Machiavelli gives. Machiavelli also gives advice on how to maintain the loyalty of the people that you've conquered. Okay? And so he says that if given the choice between being feared or being loved, you should choose to be feared. Ideally, you want to be both. But if you have to pick, you want to be feared. Because love is a fleeting emotion. Right? It's also really hard to figure out what motivates people, right, to get them to love you. Is it money? Is it food? Is it nationalism? Right? It's really hard to make people happy. It's really a lot harder to figure out. But fear, right? People fear death. People fear loss. People fear bad things happening to them. And that is something that you, the ruler, can control. You can control the amount of fear that goes into someone's life. It's a lot harder to control someone's happiness. And Machiavelli refers to the skill as political mastery, or virtù, right? The old Italian for virtue. Right? A very different conception of virtue than Aristotle or Plato. Aristotle would not have considered manipulation of the public a virtue. But for Machiavelli it is, because the goal is to create stability and safeguard your rule. The political realm aims to be mastered, Machiavelli says. And so you want to avoid having to rely upon luck or fortune. Right? Love is often a lucky thing, right? If people love you, it's because you were lucky enough to be loved. It's not because you did anything particular. But you can control people's fear, right? And since you can control people's fear, you can avoid luck, right? You want to be planning, you want to be cunning. You want to be able to exert control and manipulate the actions of others, therefore making events conform to your will. Your political ethic, Machiavelli says, the ability to get other people to bend to your will, to create the circumstances under which people will do what you tell them to do. Because they fear you. Okay? And Machiavelli says one of the easiest ways to make people fear you is through the use of violence. Okay? And violence in politics is not new, right? Violence in politics has been forever, right? Violence in society forever, right? Since the inception, it's Cain and Abel, right? But Machiavelli believed that violence can be used as a tool of political persuasion and a tool of control over the public, right? Rulers in some way, shape, or form are going to inflict injury on someone. either by how they choose to allocate resources. Some people will get more, some people will get less. Their policy preference, right? Someone is going to suffer some sort of harm in society. You can never not harm someone as a ruler, right? There are various degrees of harm, obviously, but in some way you're gonna harm someone, right? So Machiavelli is like, let's just dispel all the old notions that, like, your goal is to, like, make everyone happy and make everyone great. It's just not possible. Okay, you're gonna make people angry. You're gonna harm people along the way, and so you want to pick and choose how you want to harm people, right? You want to control the harm that's done to people, and you want people to know that you have the ability to control what harm happens to them, because then people will fear you, and if they fear you, they are not going to rise up against you and overthrow you. Okay? But there's an economy of violence that has to happen, Machiavelli says. If you hurt people too much, then people will despise you. People will hate you. And if people hate you, then they will go to desperate lengths to get rid of you. So, while you have to be feared, Machiavelli says, you ought not to be hated, because if you are hated or despised, then you invite rebellion against you. So there's an economy of violence that has to happen. You have to inflict just enough harm and injury on the public so that they know you have that power and that you're willing to use it. But you're not using it so much that you're causing people to hate you. Okay? So we need prudence. Prudence is the utmost virtue for Machiavelli. Right? Knowing when and why to take actions, to try and control the events around you, to avoid having to rely upon luck or fortune. If you try to rely upon luck or fortune, you're going to fail. Right? And he gives countless examples in the book of people who, they didn't plan right, they didn't take the proper precautions, and then they were unlucky. And because they were unlucky, they died. He's like, you want to avoid that at all costs, right? You want to avoid violent death to yourself. You want to avoid being overthrown. You want to keep control over your population. Okay? And so you ought not to conform to the standards of decency all the time. Because if you try to just be the utmost, most gracious, most religious, most holy person, you're going to lose. Someone will overthrow you because you'll be seen as weak or feeble, or you're not planning, and you're not manipulating and controlling your population. Okay? Traditional ethics in the ancient world operate on the assumption that the results of ethical conduct would be the creation of a desirable state. So if we have ethical rulers, we will have an ethical state with good people. Machiavelli rejects that. Okay? He wants to flip this idea on its head, right? Things that are good in the past are bad because they may lead to political instability. And things that were considered bad in the past, like violence, are good because they help to maintain stability. Okay? But again, it's that economy of violence that rulers need to control. Right? So that's sort of Machiavelli in a brief nutshell.